Okay, we might kick off. So, welcome everybody. My name is Graham Anderson, Climate Specialist with Ag Victoria. So I'm hosting today. So thanks to Ann-maree and Richard, UniMelb, for hosting, getting the Zoom webinar organised. We've got some great speakers. So welcome to the Forewarned, Forearmed webinar series. There's been a number of previous webinars which we'll share the link. Those recordings are available, and there's a couple more to come as well. So this is the fourth in the Forewarned is Forearmed webinar series. The Forewarned, Forearmed project, so it's around extreme events and climate variability, which are key issues for Australian agriculture. And the Forewarned, Forearmed projects are funded under round 3 of the federal government's rural R&D program, and it encompasses quite a range of industry and research collaboration. So it's led by MLA, Meat and Livestock Australia, but working closely with a number of RDCs. There's 8 RDC involved, working closely with the Bureau of Meteorology and University of Melbourne, University of Southern Queensland, Monash Uni, and some state agencies and the Birchip Cropping Group. So the collaborations between all of the researchers and team that are working directly with farmers to improve risk strategies for forecasting of extreme climate events in agriculture. So it's looking at both sort of multi-week and seasonal timescales. Ultimately end up in some new forecast products on the Bureau's website. The Forewarned, Forearmed project is at the midpoint and due to complete in June 2022. So I'd like to introduce our guest speakers. So Peter and Barry, welcome from South Australia. So Dr. Peter Hayman is the Principal Scientist in Climate Applications at the South Australian Research and Development Institute. Peter started his career in agricultural extension and moved into applied research, where he's worked to maintain a two-way communication between farmers and emerging research and science. His work spans science communication, the science policy interface and project management and applied research, and is playing a key role in the Forewarned, Forearmed project. And also welcome Barry Mudge, who's fresh in from looking at the lentil crop there this morning. So Barry's a farmer from Port Germain in South Australia, and also a private consultant with LJ Mudge and Sons. He's been directly involved with both practical and technical delivery to agriculture over 30 years, was employed for 12 years as a rural officer, regional manager of the Commonwealth Development Bank, then managed a family farm property in the upper north of SA for 15 years before becoming a consultant with Rural Solutions SA in 2007. Now operates as a private consultant as well as continuing to run family property. Brings a strong practical agricultural economics focus to delivering outcomes at the farmer level. And believes variability in agriculture provides opportunities as well as challenges and should be harnessed as a driver of profitability within our farming system. So we've got a great line of sight today from the research end of it and application of forecasts, and then how it can be used on farms. So welcome to you both. So we'll be having the slides, and there's opportunity for questions for anybody that wants to raise a question. Again, just hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen and up will pop up the Q&A box, and we'll address those questions as we go through. So and we're very keen on interaction, so please do that. So just to kick off, I might hand over to Peter just for a bit of context for which part of the Forewarned, Forearmed project you're working on.
Thanks, Barry, and sorry, thanks, Graham. Yeah, Graham. I've got that slide up there which shows a sort of multitude of badges. The key ones today are GIDC and Wine Australia. So SARDI is responsible for the links for the grains industry with the Grains Industry Reference Group and the wine industry. But I think it's really just important to acknowledge there are many partners led by MLA. Bureau of Meteorology plays a central role here, but the project does have some resources to look at this question of how do we better integrate this information with decision making. I don't think there's a single answer to that, but we can make some progress on that. And I've been really assisted by Barry, and you'll see good reason for that in a moment. I'd also just want to acknowledge Paul Petrie, a colleague working from viticulture at Sardi, and Kevin Parton, who's a economist at Charles Sturt University, and Kevin and I have been involved in an ACR project where we've also worked around this stuff as well. But I'll throw to Barry, and Barry, if you can share your screen. And
yeah, I will in a moment, Peter. In fact, I'll do that now. There we go. Everybody can see that, we hope. Yeah, thanks, Peter. Yeah, so welcome everybody from my farm office, about 250 kilometres north of Adelaide in South Australia. So if anybody knows the geography of Goyder's of South Australia, you know there's a line called Goyder's line, which is a line that roughly is a demarcation between reliable cropping land and unreliable cropping land. We farm well outside that line. And so I guess climate risk has always been a really important thing for us to understand. And here it's mainly about water, the amount of water we've got in our system. So I've always felt that if we could understand climate risk, we could do a lot better. I hesitate to use the word climate risk. I much prefer the word climate variability, because I think it's the variability that we need to come to grips with. And as I said, as Graham mentioned in the introduction, I believe that variability provides us with opportunities. We just need to work out a way of harnessing that. So that's been my challenge. I firmly believe, after being involved in farming for 30 or 40 years, that we need to take on risk whenever we can. I mean, that's the thing in farming. To make money out of farming is you need to take on risk. We're often told we need to manage risk, but the challenge that we rarely see is actually mechanisms and methodologies about how to manage risk. And I believe the way to do it is actually try to work out, measure risk. So that's some of the stuff that we've been trying to do. So I'm not going to talk about seasonal forecasts as such. I'm going to talk about this concept of how we might measure risk and then how we might build seasonal forecasts. So I'm going to use an example of a mechanism. This was done 2 or 3 years ago. This is using this rapid climate decision analysis. Don't blame me for that title. I'll blame that one on my colleague Peter Hayman on that title. But I'm going to go through an example of how we use this methodology. I'm going to have to go through it fairly quickly at the time, but I'm hoping I can sort of put across the basic concept. So the particular example I'm going to use is a crop selection example, where we had a decision we had to make whether we're going to plant lentils or whether we're going to plant vetch. Now, the decision question basically is about the fact that our cropping system is largely, or is basically a cereal legume rotation. The legumes are in there to provide a break for the cereals, a weed break, a disease break, plus to provide some nitrogen back in the system. Traditionally, that legume has been a self-generating medic pasture. Moved away from that, so we now sow vetch as the pasture legume. And in our better country, we've been growing lentils quite successfully as a grain legume. The problem we had was, would we move lentils into our poorer, lower rainfall, poorer soil type country? And so better country than we farm said, no, we're going to grow lentils because they're okay. You can make money out of growing lentils. So we have that dilemma. So basically the pros and cons of lentils versus vetch. Certainly lentils, they have an attractive grain yield in high rainfall years, and we can make a lot of money out of them. But the disadvantage is that they've got operating costs, and of course, when we have a poor year, we're going to have potential significant losses from growing lentils. On the other hand, if we grow vetch on the same land as in the rotation, we would have an additional nitrogen benefit because the vetch has a greater level of biomass, so we put more nitrogen back in the system. We've got some extra moisture retention. We blow the vetch away in spring as a brown manure, so we retain moisture through to the following cropping year, which we don't have if we run lentils through to drought. There's some grazing value in vetch. So my immediate reaction by looking at this was to say the benefits of growing vetch versus the cost of growing lentils was too much. There's too much risk in lentils in that environment. My son said, no, we're going to grow lentils. Okay, so let's go through the mechanism of how we went about trying to solve this climate dilemma, this climate risk dilemma. So what we do, and I've done this on numerous different other sort of decision questions, select 5 different potential climate outcomes or climate futures. And in this case, all we're trying to do really is take the information that sits in our head out and put it somehow on paper, or in this case, into an Excel spreadsheet. And so the 5 climate futures that we selected on this occasion was all basically associated with seasonal rainfall. Because this decision, we're trying to make this about, as we're about to go seeding, so the 5 climate futures are basically deciles of rainfall that we would get over the coming season. So decile 1 being very much below average, decile 3 below average, decile 5 average, 7 and 9 above average. Very good. And we usually find, when I've done this, I can do 5 climate futures across a range, and that generally gives us enough information to be comfortable with the decision process. And once we do that, then it's very simply a case of taking each climate future and putting some numbers around the capacity or the outcome for each of the crops. So in this case, lentils harvested as grain. We can make, anybody that understands the system, a good agronomist, a good farmer, will be able to come up with these numbers, some expectation around yields, prices, costs. We come up with some sort of a net result. I'm not going to talk about how we came to those numbers. I haven't got time to do that, but again, anybody who knows the system would understand it. Then the same can be done for vetch. A little bit harder because we've got to do things like we've got to do some valuing of what the additional nitrogen benefit might be, what the value of the retained moisture is. But again, anybody who knows the system can reasonably come up with those numbers. And so we come up with, we've basically just taken the information that we're sitting around in our head, we've put it down in some sort of a structured fashion, down on paper. Now, that's the first part of it, but now the really interesting bit comes where we can start to compare those outcomes. And to do that, the best way we find is to do some sort of a graph. So what I've really done here is basically profiled the risk decision. Now, I'll just spend a moment or two explaining this graph. Now, I look at these graphs all the time, so I understand them, but just to explain this graph. Across the x-axis here, we have some sort of climate state. Some sort of a climate state. So in this case, it's deciles of rainfall, increasing deciles of rainfall, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. So a dry season on this end of the x-axis, a wet season on this end of the x-axis. Up the side here, of course, we've got outcome. In this case, it's dollars per hectare. As we would expect, the outcome improves for both vetch and lentils as we get a wetter climate or a wetter season. But we can compare them really across that spectrum. And so obviously down here, when it's in a dry season, the lentils don't perform particularly well. We make a significant loss, as I expected. Vetch also doesn't perform particularly well, but the loss is less. And in a good year, the other end, lentils perform very well and vetch doesn't. And the crossover is somewhere here about decile 3, decile 4. Now, if I go back to my original discussion about when my intuitive reaction was lentils are too risky. We can now compare basically the risk of growing lentils and vetch. We can see here, we can look at these size of these wedges. Essentially, this bottom end of this wedge here is the downside, I guess, of growing lentils. Yes, there is certainly a cost down here, but equally, providing we hit some reasonably good seasons, there's a very large potential upside. Now, that's something intuitively I didn't recognise until I sat down and did this discussion. So my son's sitting there with this big gloating smile on his face saying, well, we're going to go and grow lentils. So essentially, this is just an example of a really simple process that I've used quite a number of times when I have a climate, I guess a climate dilemma about describing a particular decision. I find it very valuable. Whenever I've done it, invariably, number one, it explains the decision question a lot better, but invariably I find that it evolves to a different place to where I thought it was going to go. So, but of course, once we've got that profile in front of us, then using a seasonal forecast actually becomes a very easy occupation. I'm actually going to throw back now to Peter to talk about how we might use a seasonal forecast. Throw back over the top of this.
Thanks, Barry. Can you unshare your screen? I think is that right? You got to. Okay. I'm assuming that you can see my screen now, which is the industry reference group. I want to just run through this quickly. So thanks, Barry. Part of Forewarned is Forearmed has been this really useful discussion between industry and the Bureau of Meteorology. So this was at the Bureau of Meteorology earlier this year, an interesting date before we really understood COVID, and asked this question of how you would explain the message from this map or graph to a neighbour and how you would use the information, and there's some really valuable parts of that. From the industry reference group, we have a series of decisions, operational decisions, these tactical decisions of the choice of residual herbicide, crop choice, fallow, sowing time, cultivar, and so on. So there's a series of decisions there. Viticulture, likewise, we have a series of decisions that, that we can identify. I guess one of my concerns, just as I'm getting older in this game, is an element of deja vu all over again. Because from agriculture keeps saying to climate science, we need better forecasts that are earlier, higher skill, more spatial granularity, and much easier to understand. And climate science keeps saying to agriculture, so tell us, what are your weather and climate risks? And these exercises of asking about the weather and climate risks and prioritizing them are really important. But in my experience, we rarely get big surprises from those. We do sometimes, and it's really important to keep asking them. So I guess what I'm really wondering is these better conversations about climate risk. And I guess I'm saying better conversations about climate risk outside of using simulation modeling. I'm a keen user of simulation modeling, of APSIM and yield profit. An important point is that there is no lentil model at the moment, or there is a lentil model on APSIM, but it's not really reliable and available. So for Barry's question there of lentil versus vetch, he was able to do that. But if we were trying to model all of that, that would be an enormous task to get that done. So this rapid climate decision analysis, we've called it fast graphs for slow thinking. And what we're really trying to do is tap into Kahneman's idea of get this simple stuff out of our head onto a graph like Barry's done. We'll get this complex stuff into a simple graph and then sit back and be able to think about it. And so this notion of expressing the profit versus the decile is very powerful. I'll just illustrate these graphs. They are very simple, but the x-axis is the climate state and the y-axis is the profit. Now, and so here's an example of top dressing with nitrogen, perhaps the most straightforward example. And we can see that if I top dress with nitrogen under this situation, if I get a wet spring, I'll get very good payment from that, more than double my money. If I have a dry spring, under these assumptions, I'll lose my money. Now you can talk about carryover, in which case this part here will come up. So this is just expressing the understanding of the climate sensitive decision as an outcome by climate state. So we can do this for frost and for other aspects as well. We're calling this profit by decile or budget by decile. If we're doing a budget, we are doing it, I mean, we have to make some assumptions about the climate state in doing a budget. So it might be decile 5, or it might be deciles 3 to 7. But this is this idea of just trying to get decile 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9, and then ask in the driest and the wettest conditions. So one simple acronym here is what's best is just a biophysical, like Barry has done with the nitrogen and the yield, converting that to economics, and that's if somebody's an agronomist or a farmer in that area, it's very, very quick. And then the social and psychological, what are the perspectives of the upside opportunity and the downside risk. And the thing about this is we're doing it quickly and we can tinker with it and change some assumptions, add price risk and some of these things and so on. This is just stating an obvious point that nitrogen pays really well in a good year and it costs in a bad year. The obvious point is that people are asking, just tell me what the coming spring will be and I can plan my top dressing. So my answer to this partly is, you know, if I knew exactly what decile it would be, would I be in the Manangatang hall talking to you? And secondly, would I tell you? If I knew that information, that would be an enormous amount. What we do know is that some are more likely than others. So we can put this simple information into these graphs and look at the upside and the downside. It's just putting what people understand. And from that, we can look at which one is better and compare that. When what we can also do here is say, we can't tell you what decile it will be, but what we can do is talk about some deciles being more likely and some being less likely. So what we've done here is we've pushed these points to the right and these points to the right. We haven't changed anything for any individual point. So decile 9 is still the same. But as we say with the idea of the wheel is that what was decile 3 is now happening 55% of the time. And how does that change things? Well, if we have a forecast as emphatic as that, it starts to swing it away from top dressing. So simply this upside wedge is smaller here. As we move this, it becomes larger and it swings that. If we were to have a forecast for a wetter spring, it just moves all the points this way. So the wet deciles become more likely and the dry deciles become less likely. An important point is that this distance here doesn't change. What we're changing is this bit here. So again, just reinforcing this point is that if we can get someone to express their knowledge of outcomes per climate state, we can then play with the likelihood of those climate states and how the ratio of these different sides change. One interesting aspect of this is that if you can eliminate these wet years, then you start making even more change to this. So just moving on here to another decision, which is within viticulture, was to use a prophylactic fungicide spray for botrytis bunch rot on a hectare of Chardonnay grapes. So the idea here is that that this is for botrytis, that if you need to spray at flowering, and the worry is that you're going to get wet conditions. If you're growing grapes in the Adelaide Hills, you'll do this every year. In the Riverland, the problem is that most years it isn't necessary. So you can express this as the decision is to spray or don't spray. If you spray and it's wet, you're making a $200 investment to protect the $9,000 crop. It seems obvious. If it's dry, which is common, you have the minor regret of $200 spray. You can treat that as insurance. There's also some concern that you may be contributing to fungicide resistance. If you don't spray and it's wet, you have a major regret with potentially major crop loss. So this is just a way of trying to look at the logic of the decision before we talk about the forecast. Because when we first had this discussion, people were saying, oh, we need the forecast to help us decide whether we would spray for botrytis in this situation. So here we've got one of these profit by decile graphs. In this case, this is the drier years are covered in the red and the brown, and the wet years here. So there's 100 possible outcomes. Of those 100 possible outcomes, most of them, the blue line is $200 above the black line. So in most years, you're just spending money on a fungicide and getting no benefit. At this very wet end, there's a significant reward of caution because you've prevented loss, and a significant regret of optimism. There's a major loss. So it's like an insurance thing. By getting this information down here, we can then play with these odds, and you can torture the data to get this very emphatic driest third, which would be a very emphatic dry outlook in this outcome, and swing the odds that just slightly better off. I mean, well, in this case, you're almost exactly the same. There's only $9 difference in it. You have to swing the odds that much to change it because of this. But even with this, it would then still make sense for many people to spray. And what we found when talking with people is that some people spray every year and some people don't spray in a year at all. When we went a bit further talking with people, it then got a little bit more complex because, again, this is some measure of the impact of some measure of the wetness. This could be rainfall, rain days, rain minus ETO, and some notion of the profit. So again, the blue line is north of the black line for most of the time. So this point A is a point at which how often we get these conditions. And when we talk to the pathologist, we don't really know this. We do know that 2010-11, the La Nina, this happened. In the 2016 negative IOD, there was still some damage. So this is a case where you can say, at what point do we then get this level of damage, and at what point here do we get a wipeout that we're protecting from? So that when does damage start happening? Now it might be way back here, and that might change the situation and so on. Change the logic. So where A and C sit becomes important. An interesting thing some of the growers pointed out is that in 2010-11, even people who sprayed got quite bad damage. So there's also a point where even if you spray, you lose out. And so the benefit here is not as clear. There's actually, and it's this point here that was really frustrating people. So I guess what we're sort of saying is that this becomes a more interesting and nuanced discussion about risk, about where that is. It's a discussion with the pathologist about where these points lie. And partly what it highlights is that we don't actually know these aspects. So something initially we said, let's just use a forecast for, becomes more difficult because we have ambiguity about where these different points are. So this is just, I guess, where we've got to where getting the information out of people's heads onto these sort of graphs then becomes a useful point for discussion. We can incorporate forecasts and ask the question of how much does a forecast have to change to change the decision. But I guess the idea has been to try and get this information down fairly quickly and then slow up on some thinking and some discussion on it. So thanks, and I'll just hand back to Barry and to show, I guess, some classic slides that he has. And Barry, can I just ask you to try and talk directly into your screen, because when you move away a bit, your voice
fades off.
your voice a bit.
Okay. Okay, so yep, thanks, Peter. So just very quickly looking at that discussion that you were having and seeing on that same basis how a change in the forecast would affect this original lentil vetch idea. As I say, we've developed this risk profile up, and that's the challenge. We've taken it out of our head, we've put it on paper, and along the same lines as what Peter was talking about there. If there was no forecast, that's the graph that we've produced before. And we can see there no spreading of the odds. So we have a situation where it's clearly, in most occasions, you would elect to grow lentils rather than vetch. Let's see what happens if perhaps we had a forecast that showed a much increased chance of dryness. The dry 1/3 of years, the chance of that increased to 50%. What happens to the graphs? Well, interestingly enough, the decision to grow lentils is still quite a good one. The upside wedge is still actually significantly larger than the downside wedge. And interestingly enough, the particular year that we set this up, we chose to grow lentils on this marginal country, and we hit a dog of the year. We hit a decile 1 year. The lentils averaged 0.2 of a tonne, and clearly, in retrospect, it was a wrong decision to grow lentils. But interestingly enough, ever since then, we've continued to increase our lentil program on this type of country because we strongly believe that the original decision was the correct one. It just didn't turn out to be the right one in the long term. Okay, so just thinking a little bit more about these risk profiles, and when you start, I don't know, perhaps it's the way my mind thinks, but it's interesting to look at really common things that we're used to dealing with that become more and more sort of logical when we think about them in terms of a risk profile. And I'm going to throw up a few here just as ideas when we've got two scenarios, and this is a classic scenario, what we now call the no-brainer. And anybody that's familiar with cropping in southern Australia, this is the classic example. The classic example here is summer weed control. We now regard summer weed control and conserving moisture as a no-brainer, conserving moisture and nutrients for the next year, stop the weeds from taking it out. There is a small downside in doing that, and most people would agree. Certain circumstances, it won't be of benefit. But the number of times it isn't of benefit, it's not very high, and there's clearly a large benefit from adopting a summer weed control program. So that's the no-brainer. So that's just a classic understanding of what that risk profile looks like. Much bigger upside than there's a downside. Peter talked about the grape, the fungicides on grapes as an insurance mechanism. One thing we do know, of course, with commercial insurance is that if you take out commercial insurance, most of the time that ends up costing you. And on a small number of occasions when you can realise on that insurance, there's a benefit. So essentially, scenario one is perhaps not choosing to put out fire insurance or hail insurance. Most of the time, you're actually better off if you don't, but then every so often something will come along and knock it on the head. One of the really interesting things in farming is to be able to understand those circumstances where you become your own insurance policy, and you understand that you can take insurance and actually make money out of it, which you can't do, of course, taking out, well, rarely can you do taking out commercial insurance policies. So it's actually a really interesting concept of trying to work out when you can actually take out insurance in agriculture and make money out of it. So that's another classic example of this understanding this risk portfolio, risk profile. This is another example, what I'd call not worth the risk, where the downside cost of a scenario, in this case scenario 1, is actually almost similar to perhaps the upside benefit. And I'm probably one of the most risk averse people I know, and I would look at that and say, I'm just not prepared to put myself out and at the potential of losing on this end of the scale. I need a much bigger gain on this end of the scale. And I think a lot of people go along with that sort of methodology. And quite often we'll see that sort of a decision we have to make in agriculture. Similarly, this one here, this is what I'd classically call worth a punt, where there is some level of downside potential of taking on a particular decision, but the other end up here is actually significantly better, and it is absolutely worth a punt to go down that thing. So my basic sort of thoughts are on this is that if you can understand these risk profiles, then you have a chance of using seasonal forecasts to bend them or move them in a way that becomes of some value. But unless you understand those, and my consistent experience in this is unless you sit down and do a little bit of analysis, and it's only taking maybe 20 or 30 minutes to put it down on paper, it's really difficult intuitively to understand that without doing something like that. So I will throw back and stop that sharing and throw it back to Graham, I suppose.
Very good. Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Peter. So we're looking for questions there, so don't be shy, folks. The Q&A box there, type in your question. But we had one little question from Carolyn Welsh, Barry. So can you see that there on your screen?
About how do I estimate the value of retained moisture from vetch?
Yep.
Yeah, look. As with most of this stuff, it has to come down to healthy estimates, healthy and as robust estimates as possible. And you know, there's a whole range of things we can use to help us there with knowledge of soil probes, what's left behind in some circumstances. You know, I've been fortunate enough to do quite a bit of work with soil water, measuring them in various circumstances. I get a sense of what is there and what isn't there. But again, the comparison here has to be with what we do intuitively anyhow. What we're just trying to do here is trying to get a better indication of what we do by almost, by what we do without thinking about this. We're slowing down our thinking, and again, we're trying to make the best estimates possible, however that might be.
Very good. One question I've got for Barry, where do you think this particular tool, when do you reach for the tool as opposed to all those decisions where you've sort of got that rule of thumb? Like when do you think a tool like this is most value?
Yeah, good question, Graham. And I mean, I certainly don't spend all day in my office buggerising around with this sort of work. It's real work to be done there occasionally. But every so often, and it probably happens, look, it only happens perhaps every month or 2 or 3, you come across a situation where you have some sort of, essentially you say, if I knew what the season was going to do, I'd know what decision I'd make. If you're saying that, then you can sit down and start doing some of this work. You know, so I've done it quite often with livestock. I've got a dilemma with livestock. Do I get rid of my livestock, or do I retain a mob? Do I, whatever? And I just sit down and do this simple exercise of across 5 future climate states, and it's a decision I may or may not have faced in the past, but it's a different sort of scenario. So sit down and do that. So it's it's those not rare situations. It's those situations where you know that you'll either have regret or satisfaction depending on the outcome of the season. So you sit down and you try to sort of take the stuff that sits in the head and down and put it on paper.
I mean, Graham, can I just add something there? I point out to Barry quite regularly that he's an unusual person. I think
Thanks, Peter.
So to my mind, this is a really neat tool for people to use at those sort of times. I think though my ambition here is more just to have better discussion with a group of farmers in a situation or a group of agronomists about a problem, rather than seeing this as a tool of trade. So I think these sort of things, this sort of idea of just getting it out into a spreadsheet and so on is really, I mean, it's what people do naturally in their heads, but it's getting it out of their heads and looking at that in a logical way. My interest in it is really how much I can learn from how people are thinking about these risks, and then how do we link the climate stuff into that. So I think it can be used as a tool, but it's more a framework for having a conversation as well.
Yeah, and again, I sort of just emphasise the fact that these decisions have to be made. They're not. So we can either throw a dart at a dartboard or try to make them in a more robust way, and that's all we're trying to do here: is make them in a more robust way than throwing a dart at a dartboard and saying should be right. We hope we get the decision right more often than we did it wrong by doing these really simple processes. Really simple processes.
Yep. So he's sort of part of the value that it is that slowing down the thinking, and you're using your own sort of data to make that assessment. So it's just, so it gets there so it's useful for those points when it's not entirely clear what to do. So it slows you down, and you're using it, Barry, as a bit of a checker to help with your own thinking. Yep.
Very much so. And as I keep emphasising, you are invariably surprised at the result by what that slowing down of the thinking does, and how, gee, I didn't realise it was like that. And now you know, I don't think I'm a mugged farmer, but I continue to throw up different contexts of the decision question when we slow down and think about it over those range of future climate scenarios, which is just really hard to do in your head without having some sort of structured approach.
Very good. Okay, so thanks everyone. We've got a few good questions rolling in. So David Friedman, welcome David. So it's got a comment there that surely it's the net value that decides. Have you done all the work to get an answer based on probabilities?
Well, I'm really happy to answer that, or Peter. But look, I assume there, David, that your net value. So I assume you're talking probability weighted average. Look, I often made the comment that I don't know why we don't use probability weighted average a lot more in agriculture, but we don't seem to. But essentially, all those graphs is just a graphical form of probability weighted average that farmers look at, and farmers get those graphs. But yeah, probability weighted average, I think, should be used a lot more in agriculture. But for some reason, we don't use it. We use it in every other aspects of everyday decision making. For some reason, we don't. I guess empirically use it in agriculture a lot.
And
yeah,
okay,
I think there's two things. One is the relative size of the upside and downside wedge, but also the shape of them. So if you have something that goes to Barry's point about those wedges at the end there, and this is not, I mean, it's very, very simple, and it's nothing new for agricultural economics by any means, but I think just the ability to put it there with the x-axis being the climate state and the y-axis being some measure of profit, and then just having a look at it, like Barry says, you you are usually surprised by that comparison. I mean, it's actually very hard to average across a range of futures. And what's even harder is if someone tells me an El Nino is coming and the likelihood of those futures is adjusted a little bit, it becomes hard to then adjust whether that changes the net value, the probably weighted average. If, Dave, I'm understanding you right, that the net value was a probably weighted average.
All good, thank you. David's replied, happy with that. Now, Colin Peace, welcome, Colin. Got a question here. Reliability of climate forecasting is improving for 2 to 3 months out for spring rainfall. Will we ever get to a stage where 6 monthly forecasts will provide better guidance to crop selection for planting decisions? Now, you two have been around forecasts for a fair while. What do you reckon?
I think I'll throw that one to Peter, but I'll just have a quick comment. When I first met Peter quite a number of years in Adelaide, it was when I was mucking around with a decision matrix. I had a crop index model that was very heavily dependent on getting a 6 month seasonal forecast. That was part of the index that I was using. I don't know whether I was lucky or what it was, but when I used that index for a number of years, the forecaster was giving me a forecast which proved to be right more often than it was wrong. But since then, I have actually lost faith in the ability of seasonal forecasts that far out. Now, so I'll throw to people who are much better qualified than I am to see whether or not we believe that that capability may or may not exist.
I follow the wise advice of one Graham Anderson that it's a bit like Richmond football fans. Early in the season, you have a lot of confidence about what's going to happen, but only as you get towards July, August do we know what's going to happen. We have more confidence and so on. So I think that's a good analogy. Unfortunately, that doesn't match our cropping pattern very well. Now, there may be some real advantages of that, but it seems to me that so much of the forecast relies on the onset of these main climate drivers of IOD and ENSO, and unless they onset early in our cropping season, it's very hard for the forecast is only making small shift in the odds. I think the Bureau's information on their climate drivers and where they're going and the stuff that Dale Gray prepares and the following, what's happening with that is really valuable. If you follow that carefully, it's very rare that there's anything emphatic enough to make big decisions early on, and that's likely to be the same case.
Yeah, very good. Well, actually, in that, Pat Mitchell asks, have you thought about how antecedent conditions of, say, soil moisture or pasture status might shift the decision curves?
Yeah, so these curves are for a given. These curves are very much for a given condition, and yes, that they will change that. Sometimes people have said, have made a comparison between forecast or stored soil water in cropping systems or forecast and standing feed in grazing systems. I just think it's a nonsense comparison. Of course, you measure what you've got first, and then you look at the forecast on top of that. You would be, yeah. I think it'd be, if anybody is ever understanding that we're ever saying ignore what you can measure and go on a forecast. The problem is you can't measure the future, and so we have to find a way to incorporate that. But yes, you're right that what will happen, and take that nitrogen example, you can just play with starting soil nitrogen and starting moisture or how the crop is, and you can basically move the wedges to it becomes obvious to put the nitrogen on, or it becomes really risky to put the nitrogen on, and then the forecast plays on top of that.
Yep, very good. Russell Pattinson asks, how important is it to clearly know the response curve from, say, rainfall on yield or nitrogen on pasture growth, etc.?
Yeah, clearly the response curve is what we're trying to model, not model, but indicate here. So a very strong knowledge of your system is integral into this discussion, and what we find is most people who are looking to make some of these decisions have that strong knowledge already. So
yeah. And I guess the beauty of the process though is you own the data, so you're putting in your own data that's based on your historical, what you think's worked at your farm, Barry.
Yep, that's right.
I think this is the case. I mean, I just from reinforcing Barry. So the answer to that question is, if you want to, if we don't know the response, the biophysical response to the state of the climate, we've got no hope of working out whether the forecast should or shouldn't be used. I mean, so right. Obviously we have to make some guess at that, and it goes back to the point that we're making those guesses without the forecast. I just think, thanks to the Reg Frenches of this world and others, we've actually got some pretty simple rules that can convert rainfall to yield and some of these things and so on. And my sense is that, so what's important here is the relative between decile 10 and decile, well, let's say decile 8 and 9 and deciles 1 and 2. So we're really interested in the relative differences here, because that's what's making things change, isn't it? And agronomists and farmers who are experts in their domain are pretty good at saying, oh, look, in a really good, in a decile 8 year above, we might get 4 tons. In a decile 2 year, we might be down at half a ton or something. And you can play with those numbers a little bit, but I think they know more about that than they sometimes acknowledge initially. And it's quite easy to do. And then was even more surprising to me is how easy it is to put the dollar values on that in many cases, with the exception, and that goes back to that earlier question of where there's significant carryover to the next season, that becomes difficult. Or where something else like price risk or there's disease risk or something in there. If price risk is huge, what that should mean is, rather than drawing these thin lines, we should have thick lines. And if those lines become thick enough, you haven't got a climate problem, you've got a price problem.
Yep, very good. Thank you. Kevin Parton, welcome. Kevin, there's a question, Barry, about the no-brainer that you had. So maybe an obvious point, as you say, Barry, most people would select the choice with the upside risk. Indeed, if you were looking at a continuous strategy over a number of years, you would gain considerably over the long haul by selecting this risk with the upside benefits. Some farmers with particular circumstances could not afford even a small downside risk of the no-brainer. Any thoughts there? So I think it's sort of saying it's.
Yeah, well, I'm not. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I think Kevin's right with that, but that brings on a lot broader question about I guess the risk and return of a particular circumstance. And you're right, some people can't afford any downside risk, but I'd strongly argue that sometimes they've almost got to toss the coin in those situations.
Yeah, that's
right. That's a broader question.
Kevin's got another one here. Another thing, I think farmers who work through the process that Barry's worked on through here will get a better feel for this type of probabilistic decision making using the rapid climate decision analysis tool. Does that mean they'll make more use of seasonal climate forecasts?
Look again, the strength or the beauty of this is, I'm almost embarrassed to talk about it because it's such a simple process to do. It is just, basically everything's in the head. We take it out, put it into an Excel spreadsheet or whatever. So, but it's amazing how you understand the decision question a lot more, and certainly then the ability to apply a seasonal forecast to it becomes really, really obvious. And so, yes, there's that aspect of it becomes, just the going through this process automatically leads to using a seasonal forecast a lot more robustly than we could ever do it in the past.
So thanks, Barry. I mean, I've seen you using this a few times, you and Peter, and it's fascinating to me that quite a few scenarios that people have entered into this, that the two graphs sometimes don't cross over at all.
Yeah, that's right. That's a really interesting part of it, Graham. That we think of it, we think there's a crossover, and we do the stuff, and we realise that there is one particular scenario or whatever is always superior to the other scenario.
Yeah, that's right. So hence the process actually tells you, you know what, option A is better no matter what the forecast. So don't go looking to the bureau. You've got the answer in your hands there. So I think that's pretty good. If it cuts down the number of times you need a forecast. So thanks for that. We've got David Freeman again. Barry, I assume you would trust your season response estimates over Peter's models when they arrive. So I'm assuming that's the contrast between the model estimate that you're putting in on your scenario and then how that mashes up against a seasonal probabilistic forecast. That be fair?
Yeah, I don't really quite understand the question. I'm assuming, but one's integral to the other, so I just don't really quite understand the question. That's all.
That's all right. Yeah, I think what you're entering in is of a known of what's happened in the farm, whereas the forecast, you know, anything can happen with forecasts. Really, no one knows exactly what will happen in the next 3 months, but the seasonal forecast, the models will run depending on how the oceans and everything are set up. They'll skew towards one or the other, but any one scenario can still happen. So we've got a question from Dirk and Vo. So do we have any long-term estimates of how much farmers have got by using this method? So I guess we're looking at you as a living example here, Barry.
Yeah, look, I'm certainly not going to hang a dollar value on any of this stuff. I think that we will make better decisions by doing some of this analysis. But how you actually measure, that's really difficult. I have thought about that to try to work out how we could estimate that. I have a few ideas on that, but look, in the meantime, I run a farm. I have to make decisions, and I find this mechanism a really useful one to do so. So I certainly won't be stopping doing it. Whether it's whether I have the capacity to evaluate the benefit of it or otherwise is another question.
Very good. I could just add there. I think it's a difficult. I mean, part of what this does is when someone says there's an El Nino or 70% chance of a La Nina for this spring, what people as humans, we tend to overswing the probability one way or the other. So you suddenly swing too much. And I think part of this is that yes, your chance of a really bad outcome increases in an El Nino, but there's lots of El Ninos with reasonable amounts of rain. And Graham, you've shown this with another. I mean, with these other ways of looking at this and so on. So it's not as obvious to cut back on everything with an El Nino. You sometimes it's still worth the punt. So I guess at least this is just trying to sort of say, let's communicate this, that we are changing the likelihood of these different states of climate. We're not saying this one's going to happen. We're just changing the likelihood. And the problem is that because you don't eliminate the chance of a good year, even in an El Nino, that still sits there and carries it. And there's such good payoff for, say, nitrogen that it often still carries top dressing being favourable to a nitrogen deficient crop with some stored soil water.
And the other thing, just as an addendum to that, is that when you go through this process and it still goes pear-shaped, at least you can go back to this process and say, well, we had a fair crack at it, we were wrong, so be it. And that was certainly the situation that applied with that lentil vetch thing. We thought we did the right thing, it didn't work out, but we can go back and be, from a mental health point of view, you actually feel a little bit better by going through the process.
Yeah, I think that is the thing, isn't it? You got to live with the decision, but you're happy that the process of crunching that out, filling out those boxes, help give you a bit more comfort with your decision. That's right. And knowing over longer term, that's going to be the right one to do, but just not every year. But, you know, so you knew what you were getting into. That's the main thing, Barry. That's terrific. We've gone through quite a few questions. We're about to tie things up. Just a reminder that the presentation has been recorded and will be made available in the coming weeks. So thank you, Ann-maree, for doing that. It'll be sent to all registrants. And also, there's still more webinars to come. There's another one in September, which could feature me talking about how people use seasonal forecasts and what we've seen with some of the pilot products coming out of this project, and also one by Richard Eckard, who'll be talking about the work done with the dairy and southern red meat industries. So certainly you'll be notified about when they're up and able to be registered for. Any sort of closing comments, Barry and Peter? If people want to get in touch, best way to contact you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very, very keen to, I can talk about this stuff for a long time. So if you don't have a very interesting life, just give me a call or send me an email, and just Google Peter Hayman or Google Barry Mudge and you'll find our emails.
That's right. Yep. So, and as the project goes, certainly this tool is available. It's really something that has great promise over the coming years. Part of it is just for people that are interested. Barry and Peter are very happy to share it with you. They've been testing this for a while, and so only more than happy to have others try and apply it for their particular situation, because it's got a lot of merit. So thanks heaps for sharing all that work you've been doing on it and applying it. It really fits in beautifully to one party's having better forecasts, but also a key bit is what you do with forecasts and when and where they're needed. So this is where a great tool really helps with that. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ann-maree, for all of the organising for getting the Zoom set up. It's all worked very smoothly. So that's all, folks. Thank you. See you at the next webinar.
Thank you.